Welcome everybody to our latest transition webinar designed to help secure a sustainable future for your farm business. I'm your host, Johan Tasker, and as we always say at the beginning of our transition webinars, when we talk about a sustainable future here at Farmers Weekly, we mean a future that's sustainable financially, not just environmentally, and that means profitable farming. Our topic for this webinar is controlling the controllables. With so much change happening and lots of unpredictable events, not only in the world, but here in the UK too, it's hard to plan for every eventuality. But being prepared and controlling the elements you can control will help to provide stability and resilience in your farm business. This evening, we're going to discuss the importance of stress testing your business, using data and benchmarking to drive informed decisions. And we're also going to look at where technology can play a role. And to help us to do all of this and more, let me introduce our panel of experts. Dan Stevenson is Integrated Farm Management Manager at LEAF, the Linking the Environment and Farming charity. Tom Mason is Estates Director at Environment Bank, working with farmers and landowners to restore nature and diversify farm income streams. And also, you might not always be able to see him, but hopefully on the line we have Robert Sullivan, Director of Farm Business Advisors, Chartered Surveyors and Land Agents, GSC Grays. Now, controlling the controllables is all about focusing on the things that we have control over, making our own choices and our own decisions. And rather than worrying about situations we have no control over, and I hesitate to mention so early on the weather, spend time, focus and effort on the things that matter to us, bringing us closer to our goals. I'm going to start, Robert, with you. If you can hear me, how do you go about controlling the controllables at GSC Grays?
I think, excuse me, I think, Johan, firstly, it's actually not getting too hung up with the bits that you can't control. Obviously, you talked about the weather there as being something you can't control, but there is an awful lot of elements you can control, and probably more than most people think. I think the starting point is being able to produce decent, high quality data, which will actually help in the decision-making process. We ourselves often will use establish a whole farm budget and cash flow as a starting point, which basically provides that basis from which you can then start determining whether your decision making is good, bad, or indifferent. So lots of other things that we can do, but certainly my first starting point would be producing decent quality data from which you make decisions.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Robert. I can see both Tom and Dan nodding there. Tom, I'll go with you next. Environment Bank, what do you do?
I think exactly as Robert said, it's not getting too hung up on the things you can't control, and actually it's for us and also for the farmers and landowners we work with, is that it is understanding what you have got and actually really assessing the health of your existing business lines and existing revenue streams, and kind of looking at the strengths and weaknesses, and then starting to think about different aspects of that, such as what the appetite for risk is, and then what are the stresses that then come into your farming business and those existing revenue streams. So I think it's so core to it is not getting too hung up on the uncontrollables and having a really good understanding of what you are doing at the moment and how effectively, or where your strengths and weaknesses are within that.
Thanks, Tom. And Dan, yourself?
I think you'll hear us all saying very similar things, Johan, but for us, really, it's taking it back to something that probably runs in parallel with the data element, and that's having a plan and some objectives for your business. So rather than being sort of pulled from pillar to post by all the competing demands that are put on farmers, it's taking back some of that control and using data to ascertain, work out where you are now, and then having some targets and the sort of data and the milestones that are going to get to that eventual point. And some of that can involve other things that Tom's talked about in terms of diversified income streams, but also it can be meeting the sort of demands of your market or your own family succession business planning, or what your own objectives might be with respect to the quality of what you're producing or the environmental standards you want to achieve, but sort of taking back control of those targets and then the journey to get to that point.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. So we've heard from our three panelists some similar ideas there, perhaps with a different nuance on each of them. If we do have a good few hundred people registered for this webinar, and if anybody would like to submit a question, you can do so through the chat, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can in some kind of logical order, if we can do that as well. I won't put every single question to every single panelist throughout this. I'll try and sort of mix it up a little bit, pick and choose, and direct questions to the panelists that I think are probably most qualified to answer that particular question. But anybody watching, if you do want to submit a question either to the whole panel or to a specific panelist, then do sort of feel free to use the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. Robert, I will come back to you though. Having said that, I'm not going to go round and round to everybody. I think particularly at the moment, with changes to farm support, the uncertainty over future environmental schemes, etc. Even things like, at the moment, uncertainty about the budget coming down the line, interest rate decisions. We've had a drop in inflation, which has taken people by surprise, and yet I understand Barclays have actually put up their interest rates today. It all seems a little bit confusing, and understandably, the point I'm getting at is that many people are going to feel that they are no longer in control of their farm businesses. A little bit of helplessness out there, compounded by what is another wet autumn. And yet it seems to me that it's more important than ever that we actually do get a grip on our businesses, whatever that might be.
Totally. And again, it's going back to my initial report, that a lot of the things there you said actually are not in control of the individual business owners. So it's actually getting back into where you are able to control things. So, at the end of the day, you can decide what crops you're putting in the ground. You can decide which parts of the fields that you are wanting to sow, which parts of the farm you're wanting to sow. You can decide how much fertilizer or how many sprays or whatever, or how much feed you're going to give your livestock. All of those are in your decision-making process, and whilst they're obviously influenced by external factors, they are still very much your decision as to how you do it. We've talked about before the sort of the attitude to risk and how risk averse or not an individual business might be, or an individual business owner might be. So combining those two together, you can then start making decisions about how you might wish to move the business forward in areas where you can control. So, for example, on an arable farm, actually having data which actually works, which actually enables you to determine which areas of the fields are profitable and therefore worthwhile continue to grow crops on, and which areas, doesn't really matter what you do, are consistently poor performing for whatever reason. And if you can't come up with a reason to a method to actually try and improve that situation, is it not better to put that into a SFI option or something like that, which gives you some secure income, and you're not cursing the fact that yet again that area of the field or that field itself has only done 5 tons a hectare when everything else is doing 10 tons a hectare. So it's actually probably, again, blanking out the elements that you can't control and actually focusing on the areas that you can control and actually doing those very well.
Sorry, Dan, in terms, thank you, Robert. Dan, in terms of adapting your business, that can be quite difficult for some people.
Yeah, it definitely can. It builds quite nicely on, I think, Johan, from Robert's point, in that by assessing where you are in your business, you can then decide what the next step is. So the example there of areas of your farm that maybe don't lend themselves to what you've conventionally done, what else you can do with those that bring in an income or bring in a benefit to your farm. And that can be the first step along that journey. And then looking at how those interventions can be rewarded as well. So there'd be those indirect rewards through enhanced productivity, perhaps elsewhere, or easier working or lower input costs. But there'd also be those direct benefits. So this elements that Tom would look at could bring in extra income. And also we have the financial institutions looking at preferential lending rates for people implementing certain approaches as well. So there's actually, by pivoting slightly in your business, making things work better for you, you can then also look to sort of build on other sources of income and other doors that may open up to you by expanding on some of those environmental schemes or alternative ways of farming. But I think by identifying the low-hanging fruit and the first steps in that journey, suddenly it becomes a lot less daunting and something that you can sort of feature in your plan.
Could you give an example of that, Dan? I mean, in terms of low-hanging fruit, this idea of prioritizing stuff, and then I will come on to Tom.
Certainly. So one example may be that you review your inputs and your input costs and the necessity for those inputs. Now, I would always say, having worked with farmers for a long time, nobody does anything they don't see a value in. So it's not like you would have a list of inputs there suddenly you could get rid of. But actually questioning, all right, my fertilizer applications, for example, can I make better use in a livestock setting of my manure and my slurry that may look to reduce some of those inputs? And so that could, just knowing exactly what you've got, the value of that, and looking at what inputs you're having to throw in on top of that, can allow you to make those first sort of steps. Livestock feed would be another one. Know exactly what you've got in terms of your homegrown forages before needing to buy inputs in and put them on top. And I think sometimes there can be a risk that things are done the same way because they've been done that way for a long time without necessarily going back and reviewing the reasoning behind it, and where you may be able to make some savings or some changes.
Thanks, Dan. Tom, how do you understand the strengths and the weaknesses of a business when you're called in or at least approached?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you know, as both Dan and Robert will attest to as well, you know, so much time in our industry, you know, is well spent getting to know the people you are working with and understanding them and their business. And certainly, I think it's one of the core things, especially with what we do with delivering biodiversity net gain projects, is actually is presenting an option for farmers and landowners to them that it is in effect a diversified income stream, but is something that should play into their strengths, because it is applying their core farming knowledge, but perhaps in a slightly different environment. And certainly we manage our sites, or we have our landowners manage the sites that we work with them on, predominantly through low intensity grazing. So for existing livestock farmers, that is an easy adjustment to make. And for arable farmers that we're working with, actually often it's a good way for them to integrate livestock back into their farming system and perhaps start to think about some of those elements Dan has just raised about actually, you know, the benefits that come from an integrated farming system. But I think, yeah, understanding those strengths and weaknesses, it is so much of it about is investing that time and also collecting that data. You know, one of the first things we ask the landowners we're working with is whether they have existing biodiversity baselines, soil testing, things like that, because actually that data, you need to be data led, and that data needs to underpin all of the decision making, and and that business health check that I mentioned earlier.
So data's sort of come up in conversation a number of times already. But how sophisticated does that have to be? When we talk about data, are we talking, Tom, about just about information? I mean, yes, because farming is becoming more and more sophisticated, more data driven, more information driven, and some people will be further down that line than others. Some people won't necessarily even know what their soil indices are, for example. They might not have that kind of granular level of detail, but they could still, presumably, I guess, even write a list in terms of what they think their strengths and their weaknesses are.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Like you say, I think it's obviously, I think data is important, but ultimately, like you say, it is not necessarily a necessity to understanding those strengths and weaknesses. But actually, I think identifying where data will support that assessment, and then hopefully ongoing decision making has got to be that is in itself a real kind of identification in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And certainly what we are seeing is there are more resources becoming available, some more easily accessible than others. Some do carry some significant costs with them, but there are others that are far more easily accessible. And of course, we are seeing stuff such as, activities such as soil testing coming through under the SFI options, for example. And so I think it's actually understanding how you can access that data, or bring that into the fold is in itself a key part of that assessment that farmers and landowners should be undertaking.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to come to you in a minute, Robert, but Dan, on the data point.
Yeah, I was just going to come in there. Thank you. That totally agree. Data is hugely important, knowing where you are and where you want to go to, but then also being aware of some of the limitations of that. We're only just in some areas working out what data metrics are important to show progress and outputs, and also that data could be only representative of a single point in time, and the temptation can sometimes be to benchmark that against other people to the detriment of your own sort of motivations and progress. And so it's certainly exploring that. It's going to be a very rapidly moving field, but just being aware of some of the limitations of the data we have, how we gather that, and what it actually represents. And you would hate for it to become demotivational for people, or even a big stick to whack people over the head with. So it's just to stick that caveat in there.
Thank you. And Robert, you want to come in on the data points as well? Yeah,
from my point of view, I think actually some people are actually scared of data, or certainly there's probably two elements to us. Probably the people are here, and the guys that a number of the guys listening in will love data and will love gathering the data, and will be doing very clever things with data. But actually, gathering data can be as simple as can be very, very simple, but it still helps you make better decisions. And most people will be gathering data. It's just a question of whether they're actually using anything with it. The number of times I'll ask people about, what have you got in terms of certain, I don't know, measuring, sort of weights of lambs or something like that. They have all the data, but they never actually do anything more with that data. So they have a long list of saying, yes, this is what the lambs weighed at a certain point, but didn't do anything with it. So actually, it's actually it can be as simple as you want it to be, and for a lot of people, it could well be that it's a slowly catchy monkey type approach where you gradually get confident in gathering the data and using that data, but don't try and do too much too soon. Because otherwise people will say, well, actually, it's more hassle than it's worth. I'm going back to what I've done previously.
Thank you. So it's that thing about low-hanging fruit, I guess, as to the small things, perhaps the easier things to do that can have the greatest effect. Tom, is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you, Robert, hit the nail on the head there. It's actually there's lots of, let's say, quite simple element, or let's say probably data that is already being captured that actually farms and landowners might not realise. And like you say, I think probably that is that low hanging fruit in terms of actually it's applying that data and applying it in a decision. Well, applying it when you are making decisions. And those, like you say, is probably something a lot of farmers and landowners might have that they haven't necessarily thought about or applied in that way yet.
Thank you. Dan, do you want to come in on that at all? I mean, have you got any specific examples that you could talk about?
I'd certainly echo the points of Tom and Robert that data for data's sake is not hugely useful at all. And again, on the livestock front, I think Robert's spot on there. There's a lot of data there that's very simple data, such as, you know, number of lambs finished per ewe, for example, or number of lambs available for sale, that is there and can be used to benchmark yourself against yourself, even if it's not wider peers there, which is very useful. But yes, sometimes people see the act of gathering the data as the success, and whilst it is a success and it's a start, unless you use that to inform your decisions going forward, then it's of limited value.
And with that in mind, Dan, I mean, when I know obviously Tom is sort of the environment banker focused on perhaps what many farmers would consider to be non-core activities, the sort of diversified additional income streams. And I'd like to come on to that in a little while. But in terms of core farm business, is that something that people should be looking at first, Dan? Making sure that they're, I don't know, sweating all the assets when it comes to their core farm, what for many people is food production, rather than diversification, or how does that work?
Yeah, so certainly our view at Leaf would be that these things can go hand in hand and actually complement each other. We are very much a farming charity. We are very much about food production, and we believe that actually farming and food production has the answer to a lot of these challenges, rather than being vilified as the cause of a lot of the challenges that we're facing. And so our view would be actually, by taking a holistic approach to your farm enterprise, looking at all the aspects together, and that would include some of the things that people may view as not being their core business, actually you will get the complementary effects of those that you might not do by looking at each of these individually. So by looking at habitat, for example, and that's habitat quality as well as quantity. It's quite easy to measure quantity, harder to measure quality, but by looking at habitat and fostering that habitat on your farm, not only will you see some improvements in biodiversity that you could then look to exploit through people like Tom, but you would also see improvements in integrated pest management, for example. And so you would see that complementing your core farming business as well. So I think it's really very much taking that holistic view, context dependent. All farms are different, but context dependent, and looking at how everything interrelates together, a proper integrated farm management approach, as we would describe it, as a framework for viewing your management going forward.
And Robert, is that something you'd agree with? I mean, look at the existing costs, existing income, existing enterprises first, and get those. I'm not necessarily saying get those where you want them to be, because that might not be possible, but certainly optimize where they are, and stabilize, I guess, where they are.
I think there's an element here of going back to what the actual objectives of the individual or the individual business as well is. You know, if we're looking, if you're speaking to a farmer who is desperate to farm, then it's trying to actually work out how he can improve his farming business, because you're going to get more buy-in with that person to try and improve the areas that he's got an interest in the first place. Whereas conversely, if you've got someone who is farming because they might feel they've got an obligation to the family to farm, but actually they've actually got a much greater interest in doing something with the general public, worrying about the traditional income streams might not actually be the best approach for him. And it might be better to actually look at some form of diversification to actually play to his strengths. So understanding the individual's objectives and what they're wanting to achieve will actually give you a good steer as to which direction you want to go down thereafter. my gut reaction would normally be, and this would be my starting point normally, would be that most farmers are there because they enjoy the act of farming. They enjoy growing the crops. They enjoy rearing their livestock. They know that is what they love. They might chunter on about it at certain times of the year with the weather and what have you, but that's their passion. So it's actually working out how to actually harness that passion and move that business forward, and that's where we would come in to try and improve those elements in whatever area that they might not be quite as good as they could be.
Thanks, Robert. Tom, that's where Robert would come in, and we've also heard what Dan said. So how about yourself? How about Environment Bank? I mean, you explain that to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and obviously, you know, we're operating within a regulated market with biodiversity net gain, and obviously, you know, that most farmers and landowners are aware of that, and obviously realise that there is a potential there. As Robert's really succinctly put it, though, it's, you know, it's not always the right thing for every landowner. You know, it might be, and often we do go out and meet farmers and have a conversation, and actually they go, you know, I'm not sure this is for me. But also on the flip side of that, we have an equal amount who are very interested in working with us. And I think ultimately what we are looking to do is really to create that kind of mosaic within the farming business of some diversified income, with something that is not too far away from the activity of farming, but probably in a slightly different sense. It's probably slightly lower intensity. It's, you know, more about managing the habitats, but albeit using livestock to support that management. And ultimately, coming back to the points that Robert and Dan raised at the start as well, it's identifying, for example, what are the difficult areas within the farming business? Is there particularly wet areas, or, you know, particularly unproductive blocks of land that you know always struggle with? And actually, those areas might be very suited to entering into not just biodiversity net gain, but potentially using for other natural capital purposes. And actually, it allows, you know, it allows the farmers that we're working with to have some long-term, secure, diversified income, but still supports the farming business more widely. They are still able to have an agricultural carrying capacity of that land, because they could be producing, you know, they could be selling the stock on, they could be, you know, that entering into the meat industry. There is still an agricultural carrying capacity there, just albeit in a probably slightly different intensity to if they were kind of, you know, managing it in a more intensive agricultural manner.
So, and for people who might not know what Environment Bank do, this is about managing land from an environmental perspective, things like nature restoration, and generating an income from that. Yeah. And it is not an either, as Dan was saying, Tom, this is not an either or. The two things can work hand in hand.
Absolutely. And, you know, so we, for example, we may take a typical, you know, let's say take a block of arable land. We would then, you know, work with the landowner to design the habitat that they want to see on site. That is normally, you know, a mosaic of habitat. It will be a mixture of some kind of, you know, some kind of traditional hay meadows, some scrub planting, some woodland planting, perhaps wetland creation. We're involved in a really exciting project just up the road from me here in Wiltshire, where we're creating a very large scale connected wetland system through what was an old marsh that was drained for arable land. And and then we pay the landowners to manage that, and it's a 30-year commitment. It is a long time, but so we pay them to manage that land for 30 years, and that income is secure for the lifetime of the 30 years. And then we take the risk, because it's then on us to sell the uplift in biodiversity into the regulated market. Then any income on top of that the landowner might derive from grazing stock, for example, or perhaps stackable SFI options, the farmer or landowner, they keep that income for themselves as well. So they really are truly, you know, working together in terms of income from farming activities, but also from natural capital as well.
Thank you. That really explains it well. And increasingly, there is private money available for this as well as public money. So I'm thinking of things like biodiversity net gain. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan, are you becoming more and more involved in this? I realise we're sort of tangentially getting off of the subject a little bit, but this is something that farmers can control in terms of their own destiny, and when when input costs are high and output costs are not high enough to meet those income costs, people sometimes farmers will think, well, you know, this is out of control, it is out of whack, as I said earlier, compounded by the weather. So that this is something that people can do to control or at least maximize or optimize their income.
Yeah, so the angle that we would tend to come at it from is, rather than promoting necessarily any other sort of scheme or income, we would provide a framework and facilitate and knowledge exchange and connections to allow farmers to make the most of those other opportunities. So when Leaf started over 30 years ago, it was very much about, as it was described then, sustainable farming, but sort of nature-friendly farming that was actually to the benefit of everybody, crucially farm profits and the farmer as well, and provided a framework to do that, as well as being central to knowledge exchange and making connections between people in the industry. As we go through, we have a lot of farmer members, but also corporate members as well. And so it can be very beneficial to make those connections between corporate members and farmer members and allow them to explore these other opportunities for private money, as well as having some, as Tom said, about SFI options on there as well. So we would tend to be somebody who sits in the middle and facilitates some of these broader conversations, but without necessarily getting right into the detail of any of them. And then where we have the opportunity, for example, I worked with HSBC recently, where we have the opportunity to have farmers rewarded for these efforts they're making, then we would try and explore those and make the most of them as well.
Thank you. Robert, at GSC Grays, you manage a number of large in-hand farming businesses on behalf of your clients. What are you doing there to control your own destiny? Explain that. Are you doing any of the sort of stuff that Tom's talking about?
Probably. Well, we're certainly looking at it. We probably haven't got that far down as some of the conversations that have been on the webinar so far. But in general, we are probably trying to ensure that we are managing the risk better than we probably did previously, because now the risks in anything we do in the farming world are considerably higher and impact considerably more than would be the case 30 years ago when I first started doing this job. So for a lot of the businesses we're looking at, we are incorporating SFI stewardship options into the scheme, into the farming practices. We're also probably trying to ensure that we are only growing crops which there is a reasonable degree of certainty of return. So up in the north of England, we're very much focusing on first weeks where we possibly can, drilled relatively early, certainly a lot earlier than down in Wiltshire and places like that. But that's just how we do things up in the north. But there, it's very rare that we don't have a good return from the first wheats. We have a much more variable return from second wheats and winter barleys, and we won't even talk about oilseed rape at the moment, albeit it looked very well this autumn. So it's actually altering probably our farming practices as to what crops we're growing and how we incorporate environmental options into the rotation. But then the other thing that we're also starting to look at is actually probably trying to farm in, shall we say, farm in straight lines a bit more, and actually trying to be more efficient with the use of our labour and machinery, so that we are squaring the fields off, so that we're only farming the central parts of the fields in very simplistic terms, and have the outsides, the awkward bits, the awkward corners, the poor headlands, etc., going into some form of SFI option, and farming the central bits very intensively, very well, but very efficiently, because of the fact that we can increase the work rates from the equipment we're using across those areas.
So it's going to be working smarter, not harder.
Absolutely, I think it could well be. There's farms where they maybe have opportunities to take on additional land. They might actually take on additional land, but they might not necessarily be farming any more land actively in terms of growing crops, but they are farming the best lands extremely well, and the lands that don't actually give you a consistent, acceptable level of return. We look at another alternative income stream, be that SFI options, which is a nice simple option, or whether we go down the route of BNG or some form of environmental joint venture. All those options are available to us.
Thank you. Thanks. Tom, I mean, there are all sorts of challenges out there at the moment. I'm interested in, when somebody feels that they, just how should they be stress testing their business? When should they? When is the best time to change? When do you make those changes? Because clearly things can't carry on as they are on a lot of farms.
I think, it's one of those things. It's a very kind of difficult question to put an exact answer on it. But I do think, ultimately, it's one of the, especially if we look at, say, natural capital markets as an example. Within that, it's kind of, there will always be some kind of first mover advantage, because often these markets are not, they are finite. There's not an endless amount of opportunities there. There is lots, but there is ultimately there might not always be space for every farm to do exactly that. In terms of stress testing business, I think it's something that actually any business should be doing, not just in a farming sense. Any business should be doing this on a fairly regular basis, actually, to really understand, like you say, it just to maintain that kind of picture of what the health of the business is. And like you say, so identify the strengths and weaknesses that we spoke about earlier and the existing revenue streams, and then really start to push those boundaries in terms of what, so what happens in such a year where we do have complete crop failure because of because of an extreme weather event, or what if commodity prices drop off a cliff, or and I think it's something that should be regularly looked at and updated. And I think ultimately, say, decisions in terms of whether you do need to make changes or look at diversifying, or whether it's even more wholesale changes, but they shouldn't be ignored. But I think Robert mentioned it earlier. It's that risk appetite as well, though. Ultimately, it's got to be a level of risk that you are comfortable with as an individual business or business owner. And often, the changes that you're looking at are going to be multi-generational. And as we know in the farming community, it's very important that you've got that. You need to have all the stakeholders around the table when you do make those decisions, because ultimately the implications might not just be for you, it could be for your children, could be for even further future generations as well. So it's probably not a very simple answer there, but I think there's just all things that probably need to be considered, and when you are looking at changes, especially in the short-term future.
And it's good of you to say that, because some of the, like you say, multi-generational agreements, things like biodiversity net gain, 30-year contracts, that can be attractive in one respect, because it looks like that is giving you some certainty. But equally, you are sort of, you need to be considering everything, because you're going to be locked into that agreement for 30 years, and that's going to have implications. You might feel initially that you've got some control over your destiny, but then it might be controlling you.
Absolutely, and it's exactly that. It's like you say, it provides security in a lot of ways, but also, like in other ways, there is that uncertainty. Actually, who knows what the political landscape will look like in 30 years' time? Who knows, what future generations' views might be on, how the business has been run. But like you're saying, I think we always really push that any of the farms and landowners we talk to, where there are multiple generations involved, even though they might not be the key decision maker at that moment in time, we always really want to push that they are around the table for those discussions and have a say in the plans that we're looking at. And often, you know, that can lead to some really difficult conversations, but actually in the most part, everyone comes away feeling much happier because they, you know, they feel like a genuine stakeholder in whatever decision is reached.
Thanks, Tom. And that's important, isn't it, Dan? The feeling that you're the stakeholder in it and you have got some control, because farmers can feel under pressure from lots and lots of different angles, be it economic or from the supply chain, or external factors as well, and that can be a real challenge in itself.
Very much so. I think on the stress testing element, just circling back around to that, I would imagine the last couple of years in terms of weather and interest rates have done a pretty good job of stress testing an awful lot of farming businesses. And likewise, the direction of travel is, you know, reasonably well set out at the moment in terms of policy and consumer and retailer demands. The farming industry is incredibly adaptable and enterprising, and has met very difficult challenges in the past and is really well placed to do it. But I think my bit of advice really would be, rather than being pulled in that direction, and you make the point, Johan, really well there, that actually as a farmer you are pulled in an awful lot of directions. I can imagine it feels that way, pulled in an awful lot of directions by sometimes conflicting demands. Rather than being dragged and pulled in places, it's taking control and setting the direction you want your business to go in to meet your own objectives, and Robert touched on them in terms of what actually makes you tick, and also financially what makes you tick, and also meeting those objectives of your market as well. And that can be broadening things out. It can go to community engagement, it can go to the education side of things, as well as looking at things like agroforestry as well as BNG, or diversification in other areas, or extensification. There's lots of areas we could look at going, but it's taking control of that rather than feeling like you are being dragged in that direction, because I think you're always then trying to be reactive, trying to keep up, and you don't have control of those costs and you don't have control of those objectives. So it'd be a very difficult position to be in. I don't envy anybody in that position.
Thanks. And Robert, I mean, people will probably be thinking, well, look, I've reduced my costs as much as I can. Many farmers famously price takers, not price makers. They can't really influence the price that they're paid for their products, or at least not easily, especially on a commodity level. That does, though, leave costs as being, understandably, the focus as to where people can gain control. And then there are variable costs. So we've talked a little bit about those up till now, but there are other costs as well. I'm thinking of labour and machinery, and there are ways that people can limit their costs in that regard. Could you explain some of that for me?
Well, there's a number of ways we could excuse me, we could look at it. The reality is it's actually understanding where your cost base is to start with, and if your cost base is at a level which isn't allowing you to leave it to generate an acceptable margin from the gross margin after paying your seed, fertilizer, spray costs, and in an arable situation, then you need to be looking at doing something about it. For a lot of people, there's two elements to it. There's one, they might be the lack of labour, or they might be struggling with lack of labour, or the labour might have starting to retire or not be as available. So they're then struggling to actually find someone to do the job. And then also to actually continue to reinvest in modern machinery is, the prices are absolutely mind-blowing at this moment in time. So to continue to reinvest, if you haven't got sufficient land area to enable you to do that, is a struggle. So from our point of view, we are certainly seeing an awful lot more interest in people looking at either contract farming agreements or share farming agreements, where the actual element of the labour and machinery costs are being carried by the contractor or the share operator rather than the farmer, and it's a set price. It's a price that is known at the start of the season, and then you can manage your business around that. And it's certainly something that as a business, we are certainly finding an awful lot more interest, or people are showing an awful lot more interest in those areas. And it's also a way that people can still continue to be involved in their farming business if they physically are getting to the age where they are less able to do the physical work on the ground. So there's quite a few benefits to that, but it's got to be the right person. It's got to be right for the person involved, and there has to be a good element of trust between the various parties to ensure that it does work for both parties.
Thank you, Dan. You seem more and more interested in this sort of thing, labour and particularly machinery.
Labour, most definitely, and then machinery, and also it's adjusting for the sort of needs of your changing farming approach, and having the correct machinery, the correct contractors to help you along that journey. But we definitely see labour as a constant challenge and something that is talked about. I mean, one really nice thing is some of the farmers we might work through our demonstration farm network, or some of the projects we're involved in, once they start engaging with lots of these different elements, including community engagement, quite interestingly, they have a waiting list of people wanting to come and work for them, because suddenly they're not necessarily the sort of pariah on the edge of the village maybe, but they're very much a central part of that community, and when they're able to talk a bit more openly about many of the positive things they're doing, bring that community back in to seeing where their food comes from, and actually a positive shared ownership sort of experience of that farm. Open Farm Sunday is one way of engaging with that. It's really heartening to hear that suddenly they have lots of people who are waiting for job opportunities to come up on that farm, and that is an amazing place to be in, given the challenges historically the industry has with labour. So I think that is a really good news story that can accompany a lot of these things.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. There's a question here about biodiversity net gain. What is the minimum area usable for BNG?
I mean, in theory, there isn't really any minimum. You know, if anybody was looking to do it on, on their own, of their own accord, there's no real set minimum. You know, any area that can generate a gain in biodiversity as measured by the DEFRA set metric is viable. From our position as a business, we won't really take on a site that is less than about 25 acres. What we're looking at is we're wanting to try and create, obviously, what is referred to as off-site biodiversity, so away from the point of development, that is of a scale that makes a meaningful impact for nature recovery. So we do, at the smaller end of the spectrum, we do have some sites around 20-25 acres, and then our largest sites are kind of pushing up 150-200 acres. But again, it's a very carefully considered balance of whether it is the right land that is suitable to be used for biodiversity net gain, but also is the right land to be taken out of maybe more intensive food productive use, because ultimately we're not here to be in the business of taking prime arable land out of production, or the most productive silage lays out of production, because ultimately there's got to be that balance, but also hopefully proving that nature and farming can be delivered side by side. But yeah, so that's why for us it's that kind of 25 acres and upwards that we look at.
And that would be a block of 25 acres, would it, rather than sort of say, I don't know, 5 blocks of 5 acres but within the same farm?
It would need to be reasonably contiguous. We've got 1 or 2 sites where they might be separated by a block of woodland, for example, but that woodland is a very important ecological corridor in terms of connectivity between those 2 bits of land. But it couldn't be, for example, small parcels dotted around over a large area. There needs to be some ecological strategic connectivity there. So really in one block.
So this is different. A lot different to putting down the odd field corner to I don't know, wild bird seed mix or pollen and nectar or something like that. It's more involved than that.
Definitely, yeah, definitely, and certainly, we've got one site which is it is all connected, but it's quite long and narrow because it is between two rivers. But the problem is it's been very problematic for the farmer for a number of years because it's very wet sitting land. He was struggling, to be honest, to know what to do with it. And land like that is actually often the perfect land for us because it enables him now to graze what we've effectively recreated river meadows, and grazing that land. And he all of a sudden now has some carrying capacity off that land from grazing livestock that he was constantly basically losing machinery in most years when they were trying to grow silage maize. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. I'm going to put the next question to Robert and then to Dan. There's a question that says, what is the view? This is about the sustainable farming incentive, countryside stewardship and other environmental schemes, often seen as an easy option. But the questioner says, will these schemes still be here going forward under a new budget by the Labour government? I mean, it may not be under the new budget, but could the government change its mind? Robert, what's your thought on this?
I think it's unlikely. It's likely to change, be tweaked, because that's what politicians seem to be very good at doing. That nothing's ever quite as good as they would imagine it, and so they will naturally do some changes. But Daniel Zeichner, when he was in opposition, was still very supportive of the principle of the SFI and ELMS, etc. So I think the actual direction of travel is probably reasonably well set, irrespective of what hue of government we have. I think there will be tweaks, there will be changes, there might well be more options appearing over time that might be lead more towards helping people maintain production of agricultural commodities to support that and underpin that, rather than actually taking land out of production, which a lot of the current options do. But I think the direction of travel is pretty well set. Whether the funding is going to be sufficient going forward, I don't know. I have this sneaking suspicion that they're actually hoping that the funding through the private sector in terms of BNG and all that sort of things might well help offset the need to have such as big a budget that the government have to fund for in the environmental options over time. But that's just my personal view because I'm a cynical old man.
That would seem logical, wouldn't it? More of a reliance on the private sector rather than the public sector. And this is purely my idle speculation as well. But if I was a chancellor and I had a 22 billion or a 40 billion pound black hole to fill, and I was struggling to do it with public money, I would be looking towards private money. But Dan, what's your view?
I was going to use a similar language to Robert, really, Johan, in that I think, and this is purely my view, I think the direction of travel is fairly well set. And whilst there may be tweaks around it and little steering of the sort of ship, I think that direction of travel is very much there. I do also think that the mood music around food security and food production is strong. Whether that sort of bears out in policy going forward, we will see. But I think, as Robert said, that could steer some of the tweaks along the way. Our view and my view would be that SFI and other financial schemes like that would support the work you would want to do in that area anyway. So many of the demonstration farmers that would be within the LEAF network that have been practicing an IFM approach for a long time would see, oh, great, SFI options are there to reward me for something I've been doing for a long time that would support the other areas of my business. And so would I be encouraging people to completely change what they're doing for these options? I'm not convinced. I think I would be looking that they support those other areas you are looking to do to sort of bring in the wider IFM farming protocol, really. So probably similar views to Robert in many ways in terms of the direction we're going, but maybe slightly nuanced in terms of how I would see that contributing to a all-round integrated farm business.
I think one thing is clear, or has been for a while now, and that is that farmers, food producers are going to have to do more for in return for public money. The BPS being a case in point, and whilst that is only being for the time being phased out in England, the direction of travel, if you look at the emerging policies in Scotland, in Wales, and to perhaps a lesser extent Northern Ireland, the direction of travel is public money for public goods. In other words, if you want public support, you are going to have to deliver something that is perceived to be a public benefit, be it in terms of climate change mitigation, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, the reversal of habitat loss, etc., etc. The days of sitting in the farm office and filling out a form, and or getting somebody else to fill out a form for you and then submitting it and getting that annual check or annual bank payment are long gone. Tom, what's your thoughts? I know perhaps not necessarily directly involved so much in sustainable farming incentive, countryside stewardship, etc., but these long-term agreements, things like BNG, biodiversity net gain, are they pretty much set for 30 years? I mean, could the government change its mind, or how much certainty is there?
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's, I'd say, if we had a crystal ball and we could see 30 years ahead, it would be brilliant to have that kind of certainty. But certainly the view is that the new incumbent government are seemingly very committed to this, and that what we can see is actually what we are seeing is obviously a lot of the kind of administration of biodiversity net gain falls to local planning authorities, and what we are starting to see now is obviously local planning authorities starting to actually look at implementing a higher level of biodiversity net gain that is required for developers to purchase or to create to offset their development activities, and I think that this space will continue to grow. I think obviously the market technically has only been live since February this year, and I think what we've seen is the market has been probably slightly slower to establish because of a lot of the red tape it's had to overcome. But I do see, certainly we work very closely with DEFRA and Natural England, as do a lot of other organisations in this space, and they do seem to be very willingly working with us to overcome some of the challenges. And I think there is a real commitment that they want this to work. So I do think that, you know, that commitment is there, and hopefully will be there for the 30 years that that landowners are committing to delivering this. And certainly what we are also starting to see is we're starting to see the growth in the non-regulated market, so the private sector corporate investors who are now looking at how they can offset their business activities impacts on biodiversity and nature. And I think there'll be even more growth to come out of that investment from that sector into projects that do enhance nature and increase biodiversity. But that is obviously at the moment a very kind of nascent market in its very early days, but it's something that I think will start to grow very rapidly.
Is that something that you see too, Robert?
Yeah, I think it probably will. I think just going back a little bit in terms of the direction of I've lost my train of thought now. That's very clever. Sorry.
Yeah, the direction of travel, and in terms of things, farmers are being required to do more in return for public and private money in terms of not just producing food. There are more and more demands on them, and do we see that increasing? I mean, there are, I wouldn't say bespoke schemes, but individual almost initiatives that different, especially multinationals at the moment, when they have some kind of environmental, social, governance responsibility and responsibilities to shareholders, there are opportunities out there for people or for farmers to provide and generate additional income by providing ecosystem services, for example.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we have to the farmers will have to accept that this area is probably another income. So they've got to treat this as another income stream and manage the income stream accordingly. I think farmers for too long with the likes of the BPS and the single farm payment before that, and you keep going back to the other various systems, there was a lot of it where basically they were getting paid for a chunk of money for being a farmer, and they weren't actually having to do an awful lot to get that payment. I think that the farmers are now starting to wake up to realise that there are opportunities out there to generate decent amounts of income going forward, whether that is from such things like SFI or BNG or ecosystem services, whatever it might be. But they have to put a bit more effort in to achieving those income streams. But potentially, it could be quite lucrative and help sustain the farm going forward, both financially and in terms of having a sustainable future.
Thank you. And I guess all of this is about taking control and being proactive, seeking out opportunities rather than reacting to whatever life might throw at you, and perhaps being a little bit more on the back foot. There are opportunities out there. There are ways that you can take control, and one of them is, for want of a better phrase, don't particularly like it myself, but sort of horizon scanning and keeping on top of stuff.
I think from that point of view, carrying on and doing the same thing like we've done for the last 5 years, 10 years, that is now very much a thing of the past. It's more a question of what's the next opportunity coming down the line. Is that appropriate for you as an individual, for you as a family, for you as from the business where you're located and all that side of things, and keeping abreast of things and saying, right, well, this is something that we need to consider more, or it might well be actually that is clearly not something that we are comfortable with, and we move on and look for the next opportunity further down the line. I think carrying on doing the same old thing you've done for the last few years is now you are only going to go backwards very quickly.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, the landscape is certainly changing. I think the challenge is joining all of these things up. We've heard tonight about lots of different opportunities. The challenge is bringing them into your farm business plan and joining all of those elements up. The great news is that the likelihood is doing something that is good for your business and good for the environment and good for your outputs is likely to be good for everything else and deliver back to the business. And also there's lots of frameworks out there, slightly biased towards the Leaf IFM framework, but there's frameworks out there and lots of people who have been doing these things for a long time that are able to share their knowledge, share their experiences. And I think there's a big part to be played in this peer-to-peer learning, the knowledge exchange, and having sort of Tom and Robert and I speaking. There's no substitute there for actually speaking to other farmers who are doing it, who've been doing it for a long time, who are prepared to share their failures, what worked for them, and then enabling you to cherry pick those sorts of elements to it. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. There's a dynamic sort of shifting environment around farming, but I really do think it looks incredibly positive. Farming is the solution to an awful lot of things, and hopefully is going to be recognized as such, both from a subsidy funding perspective, but also from a wider societal perspective. And there's an awful lot of peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, learning opportunities out there to support that move.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. A little bit of a plug there for Leaf, which of course is fine. There is free advice out there, Robert, under the Farm Business Advice Service, which I know lots of people will be aware of, but not everybody will be. That is funded by DEFRA's Future Farming Resilience Fund, and GSC Grays are one of the providers of that advice. And that, I guess that could be a good starting point for people who realise that they need to change, that realise that their things are in danger if they haven't already got a little bit out of control. They do need to start controlling what they can control. Could you just briefly explain what that farm business advice service involves, Robert? And then Tom, I'll come on to you.
Certainly. Yes, it's funded under the Future Farm Resilience Fund. It's not just our good selves. There are a number of similar organisations across the country, so it covers the whole area, not just our geographic region, where various farm consultancy firms in your particular area are basically being funded to help farmers cope and get a better understanding of how their businesses are going to have to change as a result of the transition away from BPS into this brave new world. So it's a scheme that's actually been ongoing for the last couple of years. It actually finishes at the end of this financial year. So we are, if you are going to take use of the service, you are running out of time now to actually get on the in the system. But it does allow enable people to use a farm consultant. They might not have used a farm consultant before, but basically a fresh pair of eyes to come in and ask what might well be some very obvious questions to the business principals as to how what they're wanting to achieve. Look at how the business is at the moment and give some guidance and some pointers as to how the business might look to move forward to ensure it's got a viable and sustainable future.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert. It's getting dark here. I've just looked at the screen. The nights are drawing in. I'm not going to get up and put the light on. I'm going to make the best of the few minutes that remain. Tom, there's another question here about BNG. Are the payments of BNG index linked to inflation? £20,000 per annum might not be a very impressive sum to be tied to in 30 years' time. Just answer that one briefly, but also for people wanting to sort of get in, we've had a plug for Leaf, a little bit of a plug for GSC Grays. People want to find out a little bit more about Environment Bank and what they might be able to do in terms of BNG. Where should they go for that advice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so to cover off Sam's question quickly, so to be honest, it completely depends on the model of delivery that you're looking at for BNG. If you're looking at selling biodiversity units directly or through a broker, it will be a one-off payment for the units, which can range from £20,000 upwards, but that is a one-off transaction. There is no further income for that unit once it is sold. The model we work with is we provide a secure annual income stream for the 30 years, and there is a fixed rate of inflation that is applied each year that compounds over the 30 years of the agreement. And again, it's that conversation around risk appetite, and that's where our model is probably suited to people who are looking at entering biodiversity net gain markets but have a lower appetite to risk, is what I would say. And certainly, if anybody does want to talk about biodiversity net gain kind of a bit more generally, but understand how our model operates, they can go to environmentbank.com, and there's an online registration form for landowners, or there is a team page where you can find my details and contact me directly on there if you do want to talk about anything BNG related.
Thank you. And not so much of a question, but some understandable frustration coming through in terms of comment about it is so frustrating, and I really appreciate what's being said here, that people do not spend anything like the proportion of their income on food that perhaps that they should be spending. And it is, food prices are extremely low comparatively, which makes it very, very difficult for farmers to make a living from producing food. And I guess that does bring us back to the controlling the controllables, which is the whole topic of this webinar, about trying to take more control of the situation that you find yourselves in. I mean, Dan, is there any sort of final thoughts from yourself in terms of what people should be doing? I know we've covered an awful lot, and in the hour and the quarter that we've had, to a certain extent, we've only just sort of scratched the surface. But if there's one sort of take-home message that you would like to give people, and you've already been positive, so let's try and keep that positivity going. What would it be? What would your take-home message be?
I try and be very positive if I can be, Johan, definitely. Without stating the absolute obvious, there is so many things that farmers can't control that have a massive impact on their business. But putting those to one side and saying, all right, what is in front of me? What do I want my first step to be taking back control of the direction of my business and putting it in a stronger footing for the following year? That would be my take home. Start with that low-hanging fruit, that first step along the journey, rather than looking at the noise around you that you can't control, or the very end point that can seem so far away. Right, where am I? What's my first step, and how am I going to get there?
Dan, thank you very much. Tom, your sort of final thoughts, as it were, your take-home message.
Yeah, it's kind of further what Dan said. There are so many uncontrollables in our sector. But kind of to tie it back to where we were at the beginning, it's I think it's taking stock of what you got, understand that understanding your business inside out, and understanding the skills that you do have, and the strengths and weaknesses there, and reaching out for support, be it people in the farming community, be it professional advisors, whoever it might be. But certainly I think the one thing I would say is, it can sometimes feel like an awful lot, and it's very easy to feel a bit buried by it, but sticking your head in the sand is not often gonna help you get the right outcomes. So I think reaching out for that support is a really key part to all of this.
Thank you, Tom. And Robert, yourself, your final thoughts?
One of the things I would say is, farmers work incredibly long hours, and quite often it is just firefighting, going from the next job to the next job to the next job. Actually sitting back and trying to find time to take a bit of time to actually work out what you as an individual want to achieve from your life, both personally and business, and then not just you, the other people involved in the business, and isn't just necessarily the owners of the business. It's the next generation, it's the other family members and things like that, to all have a big understanding of what you are trying to achieve from your life. We only get one chance at this life, so we want to make sure we do a good job at it. So it's actually fully understanding what you're trying to achieve, and similar to what the other guys have talked about, understanding where your business is at this moment in time, and then trying to actually develop a plan to pull the two together to move the business forward to align with the objectives of the personal and business objectives of both of you and the wider family.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. That's great. And before I sort of disappear completely into the darkness here, I'm just going to sum up. And it's been a really, really good hour and 15 minutes on controlling the controllables. So decide what you can control and try and focus more on that, rather than getting caught up unwittingly or otherwise trying to control the things that are simply out of your grasp. Look at risk management and decide your attitude to risk. Look at not doing the same thing day after day, again and again, and expecting a different result, but altering farm practices, be that rotations. Look at the possibility, if you're not already doing it, of contracting out some of the farming operations, either individually or on a whole farm basis. And also consider the opportunities around diversification, alternative income streams. Focus on costs. It's been said many times, and I know people are are tired of hearing it, as if anybody at the moment, at this particular moment in time, is spending money unnecessarily. But maybe, you know, have another look at variable and fixed costs and ways of doing things differently. Again, in relation to labour and machinery, perhaps looking at joint ventures or machinery rings. Try and manage your income streams accordingly. And then the final thoughts from Dan: tackle the low-hanging fruit first. Tom suggesting that people should take stock, understand the business inside out, the strengths and the weaknesses, and reach out for help and support and advice, be that from Environment Bank, be that from Leaf, or be that from GSC Grays or another of the providers of the of DEFRA's farm business advice service. And Robert, work out the goals, not only yours but other people's in the business, and including employees and the next generation. So some good advice there. This webinar will be available online if anybody would like to watch it all over again at a later date. But for now, I'd just like to thank the panelists: Dan Stevenson, Integrated Farm Management Manager at Leaf, the Linking the Environment and Farming charity; Tom Mason, Estates Director at Environment Bank, working with farmers and landowners to restore nature and diversify farm income streams; and Robert Sullivan, Director, Farm Business Advisors, Chartered Surveyors and Land Agents, GSC Grays. For more information, do go to the Farmers Weekly Transition website, which is fwi.co.uk/transition. I'd like to thank everybody for their questions. Thank you all for contributing, for watching and for listening. We will be back with another transition webinar in the near future. But for now, I'm going to sign off. I've been your host this evening, Johan Tasker from Farmers Weekly. Thank you, everybody, and good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.